Hello on this bright, cold fall day. My name is Ellen Rovner, and I'm here to do part 2 of Chelsea Jewish Tours. And with me today is Natalie Pardo, who's the programs manager for the Chelsea Recreation and Cultural Council. And Natalie will be translating today and contributing those skills to the tour. So thanks, Natalie. We're beginning today at the Williams School. The Williams School in the early 20th century was the largest school of its size, largest school, elementary to middle school in the country. And it was, as you might expect, filled with immigrants. My mother started the Williams School in about 1930, and she spoke no English at that time. She spoke Yiddish. And before long, she spoke English quite well. And her parents, who lived in this country for over 50 years, never really, my grandfather spoke English because he had a business on Arlington Street, which is right around the corner. But my grandmother, very mixed. I think the fact that my mother learned so quickly speaks, of course, to the malleability of a child's mind, but also how much the education system contributed and continues to contribute to the acculturation and assimilation of groups of immigrants coming today.
Hola, su nombre es Ellen Rovner y bienvenidos al tour judío de Chelsea. Mi nombre es Natalie y yo estaré interpretando en español el tour. Acá empezamos en la escuela Williams, que cuando fue construida era la escuela más grande del país, y la abuela de Ellen inmigró a este país y cuando inmigraron solo hablaba Yiddish y de ahí rápido con la escuela aprendieron a hablar inglés y acá fue criada con toda su familia y llevan varias generaciones en Chelsea.
So I want to talk about Mary Anton. Mary Anton came to this country in 1894 at the age of 13. Her father I think they went to New York and then they came to Boston and settled in Chelsea. And her father had been very unsuccessful in business. They were very poor, but she was very bright. And by the time she was a young woman, she was noted in schools. That her school talked about how bright she was and that she was, as Justice Louis Brandeis alluded to, the best example of what immigrants can bring to this country to enrich the United States. She wrote poems that were published in Boston newspapers, and when she was, I believe, 30 years old in 1921, she published The Promised Land, which in the Atlantic Monthly, which came out as a monthly serial, but then was published as a book and sold about 85,000 copies. And it's a story really about a young immigrant girl who was becoming American while her parents stayed pretty traditional. In fact, she notes in the book that her parents had a store, a little grocery store, around the corner on Arlington Street, and they lived behind the store. The family lived behind the store. And she said customers always knew that if her mother wasn't there, her mother ran the store, that if her mother wasn't there, she was back in the back, taking a loaf of bread out of the oven, or as she said, putting some salt in a soup. So it was, but Mary Anton really was very concerned with embracing American modernity, and talked in the book, The Promised Land, which is, I think, still on reading lists for many high school students, talks about the tensions between traditional life and the modern life that they're finding in America. And she was a big advocate for modernity and, one would say, assimilation.
Aquí en la escuela había una niña que se llamaba Mary Anton que llegó a Boston y a Chelsea en el 1894 con 13 años de edad. Era de una familia muy pobre, pero tenían una pequeña tienda sobre la calle Arlington y ahí mismo vivían detrás de la tienda. Ella creció y aprendió inglés y escribió muchas poesías y hasta logró publicar su propio libro. Y ha vendido, en ese entonces vendió más de 85,000 copias y fue muy importante en aprender a usar su cultura tradicional y también aprender la cultura nueva americana.
Hi, we're on Broadway now, a main thoroughfare in Chelsea, and for many, many decades, a shopping destination for Chelsea families. We're looking down, you can see still a lot of small stores, but at one time, many of these businesses were owned by immigrant Jewish families. There was, I have a list, and I'll say it and then you say it.
Aquí estamos sobre la calle Broadway, donde hace muchas décadas era donde todas las familias de Chelsea hacían sus compras. Aquí habían anteriormente muchas familias judías que tenían sus negocios, como you want to go through them?
Okay, Sid's Men's Shop.
Sid's, una tienda de cosas para hombres.
Nat Weiner's, Jack Cates' Shoes, Shapiro's Beldell, Bloomberg's Furniture, Slayton's, Promisel's Market, where my grandmother shopped, Chicana's Pharmacy, Hawthorne Pharmacy. It was just one small business after the other. And notably, women were very much involved. Oftentimes they ran the business. They were in the front of the so-called front of the house and the men were in the back. So women were, and Rose Selesnik's ran the business and her husband was a tailor in the back, or women often also did all the books for the business. It comes from...
Algo para notar es las mujeres, las esposas de los dueños de estos negocios estaban muy involucradas en ayudar a manejar los negocios. Muchas veces las mujeres eran las que estaban al frente de los negocios y atendían a los clientes, mientras los esposos trabajaban en hacer cosas como costura o construir las cosas que se estaban vendiendo.
The fact that Jewish immigrant women were so involved in the commercial life of the community was really based on the history of Eastern European Jewish women who not only ran households but supported families in markets as entrepreneurs, as tailors, as selling eggs, selling fish, whatever they could do to help their families survive, because their husbands often did not work, or they were itinerant peddlers and would take off for like weeks and months at a time. Okay.
Es una cosa muy notable de las inmigrantes mujeres judías que manejaban mucho los negocios y aprendían a ser mujeres de negocios, porque muchas veces sus esposos se iban por meses a tratar de buscar más trabajo para poder ayudar a las familias.
So there were also on this street is Allen's Cut Rate, which is still here. That was started by Henrietta Gordon and her husband. Their son runs the business now. We had around the corner was down the street was Hattie's Hat Shop, and when Hattie died, her daughter Charlotte took over. There was Mrs. Gordon, who was a caterer on Central Ave, close by, and also Mrs. Gordon on Shirtliff Street, who made bridal gowns. So you can get a sense of just how closely, how actively women were involved in not just in running the home, but also in running businesses.
Hay algunas tiendas que todavía se encuentran en Chelsea, como Allen's Cut Rate, y what's another one that's still around?
These are Allen's Cut Rate. Wait a minute. Here, Allen's Cut Rate, and then I'm talking about Hattie's Hat Shop.
Okay, y también Hattie's Hat Shop. Y eso muestra como las mujeres judías también estaban trabajando en los negocios, no solo en sus hogares.
So I remember walking down Broadway with my mother probably in the late 1950s. And she stopped to talk to a man who was not familiar to me. And she spoke to him in Yiddish.
Ellen nos cuenta que ella recuerda caminando acá con su madre y se encontraron con un hombre y empezaron a hablar en un idioma que ella no conocía, que era el Yiddish.
So after they talked for a while, and he left, I said to my mother, I said, who is this guy? Who's that, Mom? She said, that's one of your grandfather's Luntsmen. That means that he came from the same village, the same shtetl in Russia that my grandfather came from. And here they had been here for close to 50 years at that point, and there was still that sense of community and tightness.
Y le preguntó a su madre que quién era ese hombre, y su madre le contó que ese era un hombre que creció en el mismo pueblo donde creció su abuelo, y todavía se sentía la comunidad y las memorias de haber venido de los mismos lugares de Rusia.
We're standing here in front of Chelsea Walk. Chelsea Walk, before it was Chelsea Walk, a beautifully painted mural and a great pass-through in the downtown. It was the Olympia Movie Theater. And before it was the Olympia Movie Theater, I believe it was the Broadway Movie Theater. And it was one of 4 movie theaters on Broadway in the early 20th century. A little further down the street on Broadway is condos that were once I think called the Broadway Theater, and that was the home of a Yiddish theater. Immigrants would, similar to what the Apollinaire Theater is doing today in Chelsea, they had productions that were in the native language of the immigrants, in Yiddish.
Aquí estamos en el Chelsea Walk, donde anteriormente fue uno de los 4 cines que se encontraban en Chelsea, y otro de los cines que se veían acá en Chelsea era manejado por una familia Yiddish que tradicionalmente, como ahora también hace el Apollinaire, hacen las obras de teatro en los idiomas originales de las obras.
And those productions were often about the tensions that families were experiencing coming to a new place, the challenges they faced with children who no longer listened to their parents, who weren't eating the foods of their parents, who had friends outside of the small group. And they also had vaudeville there. They had Jewish touring groups of dancers, singers, comedians who would come and entertain. And my mother told me she remembers as a child going with her parents, and she said my grandparents just loved it. They loved it.
Muchas de estas obras se enfocaban en las dificultades de las familias inmigrantes que estaban viendo, como sus hijos que ya no querían comer las comidas tradicionales o ya no querían seguir las costumbres tradicionales que tenían, y también se veían muchos grupos que venían de gira y hacían obras de comedia o de baile o música, y disfrutaban mucho las familias poder venir a ver las obras más tradicionales.
So this particular theater, which when I knew it in the 50s, 60s, was the Olympia Theater, where my upstairs neighbor, who worked for the city, for the Department of Public Works, on weekends worked here as an usher, and would let his boys and my sister and I in for free.
En el teatro que había donde estamos ahora, el Teatro Olympia, ella recuerda un vecino que tenía que trabajaba para la ciudad en la semana, pero en los fines de semana trabajaba en el teatro y los dejaba entrar a ella y sus hermanos, los entraba gratis para poder ver las obras.
This particular theater was owned by Nathan Gordon. And I bring up his name, and we'll hear it again. He, along with some other theater owners, made a lot of money early on as movies were becoming very popular. And many of them moved from this area of the city to Prattville, and then from Prattville to Brookline and Newton.
El dueño de este teatro del que estamos hablando, del Olympia, se llamaba Nathan Gordon, y él con otras personas que también tenían teatros hicieron mucho dinero, y después de vivir acá en el centro de Chelsea se pasaron a vivir a Prattville, y después de un tiempo se mudaron hacia Brookline.
Okay. Another famous person, I know there are many from Chelsea, is Louis B. Mayer, who went on to become a huge Hollywood producer and filmmaker and mogul. He's kind of an iconic Hollywood figure. Louis B. Mayer came to Chelsea with his family. They left Russia, they went to Liverpool, then they went to New Brunswick, and then they landed in Chelsea. And he was a teenager at the time.
Okay. También está Louis B. Mayer, que era otra persona muy notable, que logró después hacer muchas películas y que salieron en varios cines, y de ahí su familia también siguió en el mismo medio de entretenimiento.
Louis B. Mayer's parents didn't speak English. They were very poor, and he supported the family by picking up junk along the way and bringing it to the junk, what we call the junk, recycled metal, bringing it to the companies that were down on like 3rd Street and Arlington Street.
Louis B. Mayer apoyaba también a su familia en recoger metal reciclado, y lo llevaba a los lugares donde se reciclaba todo este metal sobre la calle Tercera.
Eventually, Louis B. Mayer decided to buy a movie theater in Haverhill that was in an area that was filled with Italian immigrants, and they called it the Garlic Box.
Eventualmente él compró un teatro en Haverhill, y ahí a ese teatro lo llamaban la Caja de Ajo.
He partnered with Nathan Gordon, who, as we know, owned this theater, that former theater, and they became the largest theater owners in New England.
Y él, junto con Nathan Gordon, el dueño de este teatro donde estaba acá el Olympia, lograron ser los dueños más grandes de teatros del área.
And from Chelsea, Louis B. Mayer went to New York. From New York, he went to Los Angeles, and as they say, the rest is history.
Y después de estar acá en Chelsea, se mudó a Nueva York y después a Los Ángeles, y ya el resto es historia.
We might have mentioned this before, but I'll say it again because it can't be overemphasized how important food is in Jewish culture, and food was then. Many people observed kosher dietary laws, which means they could not eat meat and dairy together, and they also couldn't eat pork or shellfish. Go on.
Tal vez lo hemos mencionado, pero tenemos que enfocar en esto un poco más todavía. Es la importancia de la comida en la cultura judía. Una de las cosas más importantes es que las familias judías tienen que mantener la dieta kosher, que separan los lácteos con las carnes.
But over the years, things started to change, and Jewish immigrants in particular had a real affinity for Chinese food. We're standing here now in front of Wings, what was Wings, and it's now a Latin restaurant, but I'll tell you a little bit about why.
Una comida en particular que les gusta mucho a las familias judías es la comida de China, y aquí estamos enfrente al restaurante que anteriormente era Wings y ahora es un restaurante de comida latina.
Chinese food there were a few reasons Chinese food was so popular among Jewish immigrants. One is that it was pretty inexpensive. It was Chinese restaurants throughout the 20th century really were, especially the early part, were mostly found in urban areas where immigrants lived. And they were open also all the time, open late and open, I believe sometimes they were even open on Sundays. So for Jews that was great because everything else was closed on Sundays. The other thing is that most of the dishes are vegetable based, and so even though it wasn't kosher, it kind of didn't seem so bad. And when they ate pork, which is a staple in Chinese cooking, it didn't look like pork. It didn't look like ham. It was red and spare ribs or pork strips. So people felt it was exotic, but also okay, you know. And that became very, very popular for a long time.
Una de las razones por la cual la comida china era muy popular es que era muy económica y también, aparte de ser económica, también habían muchos restaurantes porque habían muchas familias inmigrantes. Y entonces eran restaurantes que muchas veces abrían hasta tarde y también hasta los domingos, que ayudaba mucho a las familias judías. Y también la comida china se tiende a tener muchas verduras, muchos vegetales, que ayudaba a estar junto con la dieta kosher, y la única comida eran los productos de cerdo que no se pueden comer con la dieta kosher. Se veía como una cosa más exótica porque tenía un color más rojo y era una presentación que las familias judías no estaban acostumbradas a ver y empezaban a comer más de esos productos.
So at the same time, oftentimes people would keep kosher in the home, but they would eat out whatever they wanted, which always confused me because I always felt like it was the same stomach. I don't understand that, but my mother always said she just wanted to keep a household where my grandparents felt comfortable eating.
Muchas veces las familias judías mantenían la dieta kosher en sus hogares, pero cuando salían y comían afuera no mantenían la misma dieta. Es algo que siempre confundía a Ellen, porque ella dice que es el mismo estómago que recibe las comidas, pero su madre le decía que ella quería que el hogar siempre fuera un lugar donde sus abuelos se sintieran cómodos comiendo.
Okay. So in addition to Chinese food, the other kind of food that Jewish immigrants loved was deli. And Chelsea had many, many delis. We'll go by one further up. Okay.
Otro de los restaurantes comunes y tiendas comunes son los delis, y en Chelsea hay muchos de estos restaurantes que vamos a ver a seguir.
They took the foods they knew in Eastern Europe, which were very abundant here, unlike Eastern Europe. Corned beef, basically pickled brine meats, salads, and they adapted it to the American life in America. And most of the delis here were not kosher. They were what started to become known as kosher style. In other words, the meat wasn't declared kosher by a rabbi, but it was a similar style as if it was kosher.
Algo que se veía mucho con las comidas con los delis, es que las comidas no eran preparadas kosher, pero se comenzaron a preparar al estilo kosher, que no eran oficialmente, pero eran preparadas con estas costumbres.
And on Broadway, we'll walk by what was the Apollo and then became Shapiro's Belle Dell, which was a very popular delicatessen. Also Fox's Delicatessen, and further down over here was Murray and Eddie's Delicatessen that was started by the Rosenberg brothers after World War II, and they started it on Central Ave, and it became so popular they took a bigger space down here on Broadway and ran it here for a while, not that long though.
Sobre la Broadway aquí habían muchos delicatessens, se abrieron varios, unos tan populares que abrieron otros, pero hay algunos que se abrieron solo por un tiempo y ya también se cerraron.
What happened was that by the time they moved here in the early 70s, the Jewish population in Chelsea had started to dwindle. And eventually they just, there weren't enough customers. And also the city, they had a fire and the city kind of gave them a hard time, and the business closed, even though they had really big expectations that they would become a major destination, but it didn't happen.
Lo que sucedió con algunos de estos negocios es que en los años 70 la población judía comenzó a disminuir y empezaron a venir otros inmigrantes y ya estos negocios no estaban vendiendo tantos productos a los que estaban acostumbrados, y hubo un incendio, y también la ciudad parece que no estuvo apoyando mucho para que estos negocios pudieran volver a abrirse.
The other kind of food business that was very common here were bakeries. There was the Broadway pastry shop down the street where I think is it Tito's? Tito's is there now. There was Kate's Bagels, which is fortunately still here, and there was the Central Ave Bakery on Central Ave, and the Chicago Bakery on Arlington Street. Those were the main areas where mostly where Jews lived. Okay.
Algo también que se veía mucho eran las panaderías, y una es la que se llamaba Broadway Pastry, que es donde ahora se ve Tito's, la panadería de Tito. Otra que todavía se ve es Kate's Bagels. También estaba la Central Ave Bakery y Chicago Bakery.
And it was very common to go in and see the pastries that were very popular were they'd have Bubbkins, which are a yeasted bread, but a sweet bread with cinnamon and sugar and sometimes chocolate in them. People would buy those.
Un pan que era muy común ver eran los Bubbkins, que son hechos con levadura y se les pone canela y azúcar.
And the pastries were also kind of a mix of traditional European Jewish pastries and American pastries. So you had things like what we called half moons or black and whites. They were big cookies. Half of it has chocolate frosting and half has vanilla frosting. You can still see those. Lemon squares, rugula, apple turnovers. So it was kind of a mishmash. But always on Friday for the Sabbath, challahs, which is a yeasted egg bread that's kind of sweet, a festive bread that Jews eat at holidays and on the Sabbath.
Unos de los panes que eran muy comunes de ver eran combinaciones de los panes tradicionales judíos con una mezcla más americana y más moderna. Uno de estos se llama la media luna, donde la mitad de la galleta es hecha con chocolate y el resto se ve blanco. Y también muchos otros panes de limón, y lo más importante es los viernes se hacía el challah, que es un pan que se hace con huevo y levadura.
The other food, the last food I'll mention, although there are many, many more, was smoked fish. I think most Americans know it now as lox, or lox and smoked fish and bagels on a Sunday morning or Saturday night was very popular. And Chelsea had, for about 60 years, was the home to Revere Smoked Fish Company on William Street, owned by the Levine family, Rose and Saul Levine. And in their heyday, they were selling 5,000 pounds of smoked salmon a week, wholesale and retail.
La última comida que vamos a mencionar, aunque hay muchas más, es el pescado ahumado, que era una comida muy común que se comía los sábados, más los sábados en las noches, y el negocio más popular acá que se veía vendía hasta 5,000 libras cada semana.
And actually the business became so successful that Rose Levine's brother, whose name was Samuel Podrachnik, decided to break off and start his own company, and he had Bay State smoked fish on Arlington Street. And as a child, I remember going in there with my mother to buy smoked whitefish, sablefish, smoked salmon, and his daughter Celia, who had gone to high school with my father and was working there, and I just remember her hands that were soft and pink, and reaching in to pull out a greasy big whitefish, and she would say, I have a fat one for you. You know.
So, estas familias también comenzaron otros negocios y también empezaron a vender más pescados ahumados y otras carnes también ahumadas, y Ellen recuerda viendo estos negocios con su familia y su madre y su familia comprando los pescados completos para comer.
We're standing in front of a condominium building in Chelsea, and at one time this was the Chelsea Hebrew School, a freestanding after-school program, school to educate young Jewish children about Jewish life and Torah, the Jewish Bible. So the Hebrew School, Chelsea Hebrew School, was founded in 1896 by Monis and Gutti Berlin. It was founded way down on Medford Street. And then in 1922, after the fire, when the city was still in the process of being rebuilt, people bought this lot of land.
Aquí estamos frente a unos que hoy en día son condominios, que era una escuela hebrea. La escuela hebrea fue establecida en el 1896 por Mones y Gutti Berlin sobre la calle Medford, pero en el 1922 compraron esta tierra enfrente del City Hall y comenzaron clases después.
It's kind of amazing. It tells us a few things. One is that it was a primo piece of property because it was right across from City Hall, which was rebuilt to look like Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And it also tells us that by that time the Jews had already started to have some influence and resources to start their own school, where children went Tuesday through 6 days a week, Tuesday through Sunday, I believe, after school till about 5 o'clock.
Este terreno era muy importante porque fue construido enfrente del City Hall, el City Hall fue creado para parecerse al edificio de la Independencia en Filadelfia, pero esta escuela aquí funcionaba para los niños judíos y venían después de sus clases en el día de martes a sábado.
In 1940, the Chelsea Hebrew School graduated 319 students. That's 319 students who had gone through the program and were also graduating from Chelsea High School at the time. In the next decade, the number had gone down to about 200 and continued to go down until about 1979, when the school actually began to close. The number was, they had no first graders, they had one teacher, and they had a combined second and third grade. People had started to move out of Chelsea, really, Jewish people, in the 50s. There were a few reasons for that. One is that after World War II, Jews were able to get federal loans to go to school, to go to college, and also buy homes, loans that were not available to people of color in the United States.
En el 1940 habían 319 estudiantes en la escuela que venían después de sus clases en el día. En la década siguiente, esos estudiantes bajaron más o menos como a 200, y ya para los 1980 la escuela cerró porque ya no tenían suficientes estudiantes en sus clases. Parte de las razones por la cual empezaron a bajar la cantidad de estudiantes judíos es porque habían más oportunidades que se estaban dando a las personas judías. Después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el gobierno formó varias becas que podían utilizar para estudiar en universidades eran solo para estudiantes judíos.
And then the bridge was built, the Tobin Bridge. It was begun in 1948 and opened to cars in 1950, which afforded city people easy access to the growing suburbs outside of Chelsea.
Y también el puente fue construido y el puente ofreció muchas oportunidades de trabajo para muchas familias judías en Chelsea.
So, and it also displaced many people. Down around near Walnut Street, Chestnut Street, it displaced many people, many of them who were older, and they either left the city or went into some kind of senior care or went to live with their children. So that was, there was a big reduction in the population because of the bridge.
La construcción del puente también dejó a muchas familias y muchas personas sin hogares. Después, y particularmente personas mayores de edad, y eso aportó a que la población de la comunidad en Chelsea bajó mucho y muchas personas tuvieron que mudarse a otras ciudades fuera de esta área, o se tuvieron que mudar las personas mayores con sus hijos y con sus nietos porque ya quedaron sin sus hogares.
So families started moving away from their parents. So prior to World War II, it was pretty typical that multi-generations of families either lived in the same house or lived in the same community, worked in Chelsea as well, had businesses. But after World War II, that started to change.
Muchas familias también empezaron a vivir aparte de sus familias. Tradicionalmente siempre se mantenían, las generaciones vivían cerca y vivían hasta juntos, pero después de un tiempo comenzaron a mudarse más lejos y empezaron a formar sus propias familias fuera de las mismas ciudades.
Many of the Jewish men here, as we've talked about, were small business owners, but their children were becoming college educated and they were becoming professionals. I'm sure you've heard the expression, women and men saying, well, my son, the doctor. And that speaks to the interest, the desire to have professional children who did not have to work 6 days a week from 6 in the morning till 6 at night.
Anteriormente las personas judías tendían a tener sus propios negocios, pero poco a poco empezaron a educarse más los hombres y mujeres y empezaron a trabajar más en trabajos como médicos, y ya no estaban trabajando los mismos horarios, sino eran más educados.
So that said, by the 1950s, there were about 8,000 Jewish people still living in Chelsea, as compared to just before World War II, when the population peaked. Chelsea's population peaked at 44,000, and over half of those 44,000 were Jewish. But we're here in the 50s now, and there were still 14 synagogues open in Chelsea, and the Hebrew school was still doing well. As I said, by the late 70s, the population had started to decline, and the last president of the Hebrew school, Dr. Israel Kamens, a medical doctor who lived down the street on Washington Ave, tried very hard to increase the enrollment, and he offered scholarships that he advertised in local papers, but he didn't get very many takers. So the school closed in 80. They continued to have services here, Sabbath services, for about a year or so, and then it was sold to a developer.
En los 1950 la población judía de Chelsea comenzó a disminuir. Habían alrededor de 8,000 judíos en el área y comenzaron a mudarse a otras áreas. Todavía había una población fuerte, pero comenzó a disminuir, y en los 1970s fue cuando ya se comenzaron ya no se veían muchas personas judías. Uno de los últimos presidentes de la escuela hebrea, el doctor Israel Kamens, era un médico aquí en la comunidad, y él ofrecía muchas becas para los niños judíos en un intento para tratar de mantener un poco más de la cultura judía en la comunidad.
You can see up there is a menorah. Menorah is a candelabra that's used at Jewish holidays and on the Sabbath. And then it's covered by ivy on the frieze on top, but you can see tablets representing the Ten Commandments.
Ahí arriba se puede ver el menorah, que es algo que se usa tradicionalmente en los festivos judíos, y también se tapa aquí con los árboles, pero también están las tabletas donde están los 10 mandamientos.
Also notice there's the Star of David, Jewish, which is a symbol for Judaism, and then over here you can see the tablets are repeated all the way across. So there's Jewish iconic, I can't say the word. So there's Jewish symbols throughout on the building, and I'll show you one more.
En el edificio podemos ver más símbolos judíos donde se ve la estrella de David y más tabletas donde se pueden ver los símbolos judíos.
Here is the cornerstone to this building. It says, this cornerstone laid October 1928 by the Ladies Auxiliary to the Hebrew School. Again, it speaks to the involvement of women in the community. Over here, the same thing is written, but it's in Yiddish. It's in Hebrew letters, but the language is Yiddish. And if I could read it, I would, but I can't, so, okay.
Aquí vemos una de las piedras que fue usada en la construcción y se ve la importancia de las mujeres en esta comunidad, que fueron parte de las que ayudaron a fundar este edificio en octubre del 1928. Está en inglés a un lado y al otro lado podemos ver lo que está en Yiddish.
Hi, we're now on Crescent Ave, and we're standing in front of a parking lot which was the site of the beloved Chelsea YMHA, Young Men's Hebrew Association. It was a social center, a cultural center for Jews in the city, and as one woman said to me, she said, this was my country club. This is where I went to see all my friends. It's where I went to summer camp as a child. They had a day camp called Camp Menorah. They ran for many years. They used to take us, busloads of kids, to Revere Beach to go swimming into MDC pools. We had red bathing caps so that we could always be identified.
Okay, aquí estamos sobre la avenida Crescent y aquí donde estamos parados es donde se encontraba el centro comunitario para personas de judías. Y aquí es donde Ellen recuerda que ella venía cuando era niña a un campamento en verano y se venían en bus y los llevaban a paseos a la playa, y ella recuerda que las actividades que hacía en este centro comunitario.
They also had sports, a lot of athletic activities here. They had two different groups for teenage boys. They were part of the American Zionist Association, known as AZA, and Chelsea had not one but two groups. They had the Clovers, the Chelsea Clovers, and also the Chelsea Lubels, both of whom, when I was in high school, were known for being quite wild, quite almost troublemakers, but of course very appealing to many teenage girls.
Okay. Ella recuerda que los programas de los deportes eran muy populares acá y tenían dos diferentes grupos de deportes y eran muy populares y eran reconocidos por causar un poco de problemas, pero tal vez eso atraía más a las muchachas en la comunidad.
By the 1980s, many of the people coming to the Y were older, and they did a very large program of senior lunches, and eventually then they joined forces with the community center, Jewish community center in Revere, but eventually they both closed.
En los 1980s, la gente que asistía al centro comunitario ya eran personas mayores y tenían un programa de comida que era un poco popular, pero ya después tuvieron que unirse con un grupo en Riviera y al final ya tuvieron que cerrar todos los centros.
And when they closed, it's people still really are very have very fond memories of we called it the Waimeche, and it was sorely missed.
Aunque cerraron, todavía mucha gente tiene muchas buenas memorias del centro comunitario y es algo que se extraña dentro de la comunidad judía.
If you look, there used to be like stained glass windows there. Mm-hmm. So when the gentleman, what happened was there was a 1970s drop ceiling, and the horse here, one of these things was cracking. Mm-hmm. And so we raised a massive amount of money and refurbished the way it used to be.
That's great.
And with the balcony, the Rapunzel balcony and all this stuff. So we knew that that was approximately 1820 or 30 or whatever, that side mm-hmm. of it. So the contractor said, did you know, blah, 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 and he was talking about the post and beam foundation. He said, this side must be more like 1770s, something wow. like that. But when we looked above where the drop ceiling was, mm-hmm. there are stained glass windows in this wall, which proves that there was no hallway there, and that this building, at least for a long time, stood by itself. And that building was an additional building, because there were outside windows all along here, so all along that hallway. So I think Marsha Johnson has a great deal of information on this, and I think this was a meeting house in the 1700s.
It has the Federalist configuration of a colonial meeting house, which in the 18th century combined civic and religious activities. We're trying to get a historic preservation grant to refurbish the outside.
Yeah, it's something. I love the Romeo and Juliet balcony.
Yeah, this was all covered by sheetrock, and we never saw it before. Right. And then discovered it up there.
This was constructed by Chelsea's Second Baptist Church in the 18th century.
Really?
Then they took over, they built the building that's the rest of this in the 1860s. And then they sold out to the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1904. Right. So it's got an interesting history. And then in 1939, the second generation Jews who didn't want the Orthodox type of approach, who had formed their own informal worship congregation at the Hebrew school, the Chelsea Hebrew School, they had enough money saved up to buy this building from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1939. And that was the beginning of the modernization.
So they wanted something that didn't feel traditional.
That's right. They were the one conservative synagogue surrounded by 14 Orthodox shuls.
It's also thought that they might have even been reformed early on, because there's, from the 30s, there were records of girls having bat mitzvahs.
Yeah. Secretly.
You know, which is really didn't become quite common until latter parts of the 20th century. Right. So that was happening here as well. And my information was that, you know, it was started as Temple Bethel on Crescent Ave. What was, we went to the parking lot, which was the YMHA, and then the stock market crashed, and everybody lost a lot of money. This was told to me by an older member of the congregation a few years ago. And he said that the people with the money just took off and left and started their own thing. So this was also, by virtue of its location in a kind of suburban area of Chelsea, really marked a big change, as Herb has mentioned. A big change from it being people living in really close quarters with the synagogue in the corner, like a sort of shtetl kind of mentality, to a more Americanized and more middle-class congregants. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about Temple Emmanuel is that the changes that were happening here, which were men and women sitting together in services, not separated, like as we saw at Walnut Street, the women sitting upstairs and the men downstairs. and also the liturgy was, a lot of it was in English, not just in Hebrew, but it foreshadowed early on in the 40s, it foreshadowed major changes in American Judaism that happened throughout the country, of more of the secularization of American Judaism.
I just want to tell you what, there's a bat mitzvah here from 1938,
I know.
which is unheard of.
What I wanted to mention is that, from what I understand, the congregation was founded in the old Chelsea Hebrew School, which was called the Talmud Torah, in 1927, we just found out. And in 1929, they built the building on Crescent Avenue as temple, I think, congregation Beth-El, yeah. And that was supposedly opened as an Orthodox congregation, similar to the other ones. And for 10 years, they waited, and then they eventually bought this building that was unoccupied in 1939 and officially became conservative, where everyone would be sitting together. This is an English Bible, and with pen and quill in the front and the back, in handwriting. There are bas mitzvahs were when the girls were confirmed, which wasn't accepted in the Orthodox tradition. And there are bas mitzvahs that happened in those 10 years. And it's who and the name and the date. And they happen kind of in a secret, more undergroundy way when they were in that other building. So it was kind of like the Americanization of the first generation in this country, and their children and their grandchildren. So it's in the front and the back, all these secret things. And we discovered this in the ark here when we were cleaning out to make room for our first refurbishment bas mitzvah in around 2002.
Really? That's when we found it?
We found it actually during my son's bar mitzvah.
Oh, then.
Yeah, when you were doing over the ark. Yeah.
And also what I've learned from one of our older congregants is that this temple was the sophisticated synagogue around, and men in tuxedo, the ushers, the greeters, were walking around the aisles. So that's...
Yeah, it was also a place where people who had started to make it could kind of flaunt their success. In fact, a few years ago, I did some research on Rabbi Rod Wogan, who was a long-time rabbi here for, 50 years. And I got a hold of some of his sermons from the 60s and the 70s, and it was all about growing materialism. And it really spoke to the ambivalence that was felt in many Jewish communities about upward mobility. That they were, yes, becoming very successful, but what were they losing? What kind of sense of community, sense of family were they losing in the process? And it's interesting to me that here, when so many people, so many of the families who were here were really experiencing those tensions on a daily basis, where there were older parents and younger children, and they were going off in kind of different directions. You know.
Can we show you around?
Yeah, show them.
So this is a newly created children's corner. I was planning it for a long time, and finally it happened. And thank you, Herb. And this, we are ready for services at any time to celebrate Shabbat or any other services. I think I'm Rabbi Oksana Chapman. I'm the rabbi and cantor and chaplain with the last name Chapman, so I'm playing on words. So let's go look at our gorgeous sanctuary that was renovated 3 years ago.
It's been an ongoing process, but...
These are the prayer shawls, talisim or talit. Men usually wear it during at Orthodox shuls. during morning services, and only on Yom Kippur once a year we wear it at night as well for Kol Nidre.
Estas son las telas que se utilizan cuando se va a orar en las mañanas, más que todo las usan los hombres y también en algunos festivos se usan en las noches también.
And this is the heart of every synagogue. Ellen, would you like to open the ark to show the Torahs? Because when Dalai Lama invited many rabbis of different denominations to ask them one question, what is our survival secret? We said that because we are not rooted in the land. And Torahs, these are the Torahs, here the 5 books of Moses. You can pick them up and go anywhere. So this is the heart of every synagogue.
Este es el corazón de la sinagoga. Como tantos judíos ya no viven en sus tierras natales, se puede encontrar en el corazón de toda sinagoga, es donde tienen las Toras, y ahí se pueden ver donde abrimos las cortinas, donde tienen los libros.
And we just celebrated Rosh Hashanah, that's why you see the apples, the shofar. Ellen, can you pick up the shofar to show? Because.
Want me to blow it?
Oh, yeah. Sally, please.
This is Sarah Lee Callahan. Sarah Lee is the president of Temple Emmanuel and also an accomplished shofar blower.
Yes.
The shofar is from ancient times. It's used to call people to prayer.
And it's a ram's horn.
Aquí acaban de celebrar Rosh Hashanah y ahí podemos ver donde tienen todo preparado en la mesa, y ahí nos acaba de mostrar Sarah Lee, quien es la presidenta de la sinagoga, una de las cosas que se utilizan en este festivo.
This sound's supposed to wake us up to life renewed. Every year we're supposed to renew ourselves and our lives around. So.
Este sonido la intención es que nos ayude a levantarnos, a despertarnos, y cada día para poder renovarnos y utilizar ese ruido para comenzar nuestros días.
I want to point out also the windows here. These are the stained glass windows that I think really were left from when it was a church. They're not all that common in Jewish houses of worship. But if you notice, each window has names of families and individuals on them. And they were all donated by members of the congregation in honor of a child being born, in honor of a graduation, in memory of a loved one who was lost. It was a way for the congregation to help support itself. And you can, I love looking at it because it really tells, in many ways, tells the story of a community. And it's quite amazing. So I've also, different social groups would buy a window and whatever. Many of these, like these light fixtures, are from the 1950s. And one of the congregants told me a number of years ago that she was sitting at services that, as Oksana had described, for Rosh Hashanah, and there was, or Yom Kippur, and there was a move to raise some money for the temple, and they were particularly interested in getting people to donate for these, and it was $150, which in the early 50s was, you know, a fair amount of money. And this woman raised her hand. She had 2 sisters, and the 3 of them were born and raised in Chelsea and bringing up their children in Chelsea and worked in Chelsea. And so she offered to buy one for, in the name of her sisters and her. And she said, so each one had to donate $50. So she said afterwards, her sisters are like, what did you do? What did you do? But it's wonderful because for many years she looked up at these lights and thought about her sisters who had long since passed. So.
Aquí podemos ver las ventanas que pensamos que tal vez fueron dejadas de cuando este edificio era una iglesia, pero después fueron cambiadas y podemos ver los nombres de personas que han patrocinado en parte de la sinagoga y se pueden ver los nombres de que se han comprado de organizaciones o en memoria de algún ser querido. Y también podemos ver aquí en las luces, también fue otro programa que se utilizó para recoger más fondos para la sinagoga, y Ellen nos cuenta sobre unas 3 hermanas que en el 1950 patrocinaron una de estas luces y en ese entonces estaban pidiendo $150 para poder comprar cada una, y eso era mucho dinero para ellas, pero después de eso cada hermana podía ver las luces y saber que fue comprado en nombre de ellas.
One of our projects that we are working on, we have many projects. One of them is to create the historical exhibit, because we found in sorting out entire temple last year before COVID started, we found so many interesting, unusual artifacts. The oldest checks we found from 1937, and they're still around. So the old prayer books, I found an amazing Haggadah that we use on Passover Seder. It's like a book, but it's just beautiful. So this is what we are working on right now, one of our many projects.
Uno de los muchos proyectos que tienen aquí es que están creando una exhibición porque en las renovaciones que han estado haciendo con el edificio han encontrado muchas cosas históricas de los años 1930, han encontrado cheques y han encontrado muchas cosas que quieren poder colectar y formar una exhibición para que la gente pueda verlos.
I think this window definitely needs to be shown.
As well as the clock from Chelsea Clock. That's a clock from the Chelsea Clock Company, which we know has been around for hundreds of years.
También pueden ver ahí el reloj, que es parte de la compañía de los relojes de Chelsea, que llevan muchos años en la comunidad.
And when we have our exhibit finished, we would like to open it to greater Chelsea community to come, not only see the walls, but see the materials and books and pictures. And we have a whole exhibit.
Okay, I want to show you these are memorial awards. In Jewish culture and law, when a person has died, every year you remember them on the anniversary of their death by saying prayers. It's called Yortzeit. That's the anniversary of somebody's death. And what people do at synagogues is that when they lose a loved one, they buy a plaque donating some of the funds to the synagogue that has the person's name in English and in Hebrew, and the date of their death. And when all these 18 to 22 synagogues were closing in Chelsea, people had, they were filled with plaques like this. And some of them are at the public library, at the archives, but some of them were given to the synagogues that were still open. So for instance, like this one is from, I think one is from Shortliff Street Synagogue, one is from Chestnut Street, from different synagogues around the city, but most of these are Temple Emmanuel.
En la cultura y la ley judía, después de que una persona muere, se debe honrar cada año en el aniversario de su muerte. Aquí eso se representa con las placas que compran las personas en el aniversario de la muerte de las personas. Cuando muchas sinagogas se cerraron en Chelsea, muchas placas fueron donadas a la biblioteca de Chelsea y ahí se pueden encontrar todavía, o hay otras que pasaron las placas aquí, donde todavía se pueden ver, y aquí podemos ver todos los nombres de las personas.
So over here, this is the synagogue where my parents were married, and my father's family came, and this is my great-grandfather, great-grandmother, and a great-uncle.
Esta fue la sinagoga donde los padres de Ellen fueron casados y aquí se pueden ver los nombres de sus abuelos, ahí mismo y su bisabuelo también.
Over here, right in the center, this is really striking to me. This is a plaque in memory of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who died in 1945, who was loved and revered by many people, and also the Jewish community. And at that time, the Jewish community was not, and the American Jewish community was not aware that he had not allowed boats of refugees, of people escaping Nazi Germany, to come to the United States. We didn't know that then. But that said, people attributed moving from the Depression and basically winning the war to FDR. So he was a much-loved president. And Temple Emmanuel honored him with that plaque. And I love that it's like right in the middle.
Aquí vemos una placa que fue puesta en honor al presidente Franklin Delano Roosevelt, que fue una persona que se quería mucho en la comunidad judía y fue alguien que ayudó mucho en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Ya después vieron que él no apoyó mucho a los inmigrantes judíos que estaban tratando de escapar en la guerra, pero en ese entonces era un presidente que fue muy querido dentro de la cultura judía y lo honraron aquí en todo el centro de la placa.
And this is the Book of Life, speaks for itself. If you can come closer, because it's done with real gold, I would assume. It's really a treasure. It's pretty thick, as you can see. And here are the names of the bar mitzvahs. It's for boys. And the earliest day I could see 1935.
Aquí vemos el libro de la vida donde está hecho en parte con oro real y vemos aquí los bar mitzvahs, que es donde se celebran a los niños cuando cumplen una edad, y ahí vemos el primero que está en el libro es del 1935.
The Book of Life marks major milestones in individuals, families, and the community's lives, starting with births, going through graduations, going through birthdays, going through bar and bat mitzvahs, going through anniversaries, going for special birthdays, and also marking people's deaths. So it's beautifully inscribed throughout here, which is really like it's a story. It's a wonderful story.
And bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah is becoming of age. Okay. The girls at 12 years old and boys at 13.
El libro de la vida nota muchas fechas importantes como nacimientos y muertes, y también nota las bar mitzvahs y bat mitzvahs, que es cuando cumplen una edad que son considerados ahora adultos. For girls it's age 12. Para las mujeres es en la edad cuando cumplen 12 años y para los hombres cuando cumplen 13 años.
Anyway, so this building, this congregation, is a beautiful, beautiful example of the diversity in Chelsea through the ages. That Chelsea didn't just become a diverse, multicultural city, that it has been this way pretty much since its inception in the 1700s. And I love to look around here because you can see the layers of, a New England-style church that for most of the 20th century now has been, and the 21st, has been a Jewish synagogue. So.
Aquí podemos ver con este edificio realmente la diversidad que Chelsea siempre ha tenido, viendo que empezó como iglesia, pero en la mayoría del siglo XX ha sido una sinagoga y el siglo XXI también.
And today we are about 100 families, more or less. We're still trying to count. A very warm, in Yiddish we say heimish, very friendly, warm community that still exists, and some people get very surprised. Really? There are Jews in Chelsea? Still? Yeah. And I said, yes, we still exist here. So welcome and come in anytime, especially after COVID, I think.
Aquí tienen una membresía de aproximadamente 100 familias que todavía viven aquí en Chelsea y notando que todavía sigue una comunidad pequeña, pero existe aquí la comunidad judía en Chelsea y notar que siempre están bienvenidos y especialmente ya cuando esté la situación de salud un poco mejor, les encantaría poder tener a más familias aquí para que conozcan todo lo que tienen.
The two memorial plaques in the yard that
Oh,
honor
right,
veterans.
right.
And,
That's
and the
you can go
World War
outside.
I monument was on Crescent Avenue and got moved here.
I
And the
thought it
World
was in-
War II,
yeah.
the World War II is right next to it, and they're both in the corner of the yard.
Well, the World War I was, the first Jewish boy to die in World War I was a young man. I don't even know if he was 20 years old yet. His name was Max Address, and they used to have a memorial used to be at 3rd and Everett Ave, but it was moved, and I thought it was here, but we'll see. It's really a shame, I think, about how in the present we don't value our daily lives and the kinds of cultures that we're making. And so oftentimes, especially among immigrants who are really struggling to survive, there's not a real desire to keep everything because people wanted to become American, and they let a lot of things go. So there are not as many records of Chelsea's Jewish community as what one might think. So we really cherish all of this and the stones that Sarah Lee just mentioned outside.
Queremos notar unos monumentos afuera que vamos a ver en honor a la Primera y Segunda Guerra Mundial, pero también de notar que realmente ya no se honran ni se ven mucho las memorias de las culturas y la historia que tiene la gente, y por eso estamos agradecidos por un edificio como este que todavía muestra y tiene muchos elementos que podemos ver de las cosas históricas de la cultura judía aquí.
We're standing in front of a private home, which at one time was a yeshiva. A yeshiva is a Jewish day school, similar to a parochial school. And in 1940, the Walnut Street Synagogue imported a young rabbi from New York City whose name was Rabbi Avram Miller. And he was an Orthodox rabbi, and they had him come because they were afraid that the young people were becoming too assimilated.
Aquí estamos enfrente de lo que ahora es un hogar privado, pero esto antes era un programa que se llamaba Yeshiva, donde venían las personas judías para aprender más sobre su cultura, y en el 1900, what was the year?
1940.
En el 1940 vino el Rabbi Miller para ayudar a la comunidad en Chelsea poder crecer más en aprender sobre la cultura judía que se estaba comenzando a perder.
Okay. So Rabbi Miller went about trying to help people in Chelsea, help families, keep their kids closer to Judaism. And he got some wealthy people in Boston and a bunch of Orthodox rabbis to help organize a Torah Talmud Academy, this building.
Este Rabbi Miller con otro grupo de judíos querían comenzar a mantener la religión judía y no solo la cultura, y formaron acá esta escuela para ayudar a mantener la religión judía en Chelsea.
So when they opened the yeshiva, also known as the Torah Talmud Academy, they marched from the Chelsea Hebrew School, where we visited, down on the corner of Broadway and Chestnut. They marched 300 people, marched through the streets here carrying 3 Torahs, 3 religious scrolls, to open this new school.
cuando abrieron esta escuela, marcharon desde la escuela que visitamos anteriormente, con 300 personas, de diferentes personas del área vinieron oficialmente con los libros judíos para abrir esta escuela.
The ribbon cutting ceremony was attended by very prominent people. The mayor of Chelsea at that time, Bernard Sullivan, really encouraged everybody to support the new school. And one of the philanthropists who had contributed a lot of money was a man named Harry Kraft, who had a dress factory in Boston, and he was the father of Robert Kraft, who most of us know as the owner of the Patriots.
Cuando se hubo la ceremonia oficial para abrir esta escuela, el alcalde de Chelsea en ese entonces, Bernard Sullivan, apoyó mucho en la escuela y urgía a los residentes de Chelsea que apoyaran a la escuela. Y una de las personas que apoyó también el evento se llamaba Harry Kraft, quien es el padre de Robert Kraft, como conocemos el nombre por ser el dueño del equipo de los Patriots.
So in the 1950s, I went to preschool here, along with many other young Jewish people. And also, I remember going to East Boston in the station wagon that picked me up at the Burma Road Projects to take me here, and made a stop in East Boston, pick up students in East Boston.
En los 1950 Ellen estuvo en esta escuela. Ella recuerda que la recogían desde su casa y viajaban a East Boston a recoger a más niños y de ahí venían acá a la escuela.
It's here that I learned the Hebrew alphabet and just the very basics of Judaism.
Aquí aprendió el abecedario hebreo y todos los principios de la cultura judía.
So we're going to end here. I want to thank you all for accompanying Ricky, Natalie, and me, and in the first part, Jose, on a Chelsea Jewish tour. Ending here is I think, a reminder to all of us that immigrant communities, such as Chelsea, contribute so much to our society and our cultures. We are a nation, in fact, of immigrants, and that everything we do in our families, in our community, and our groups are worthy. All our activities are worthy of being documented, cherished, celebrated, and told again and again in really important stories.
Aquí vamos a concluir el tour y queremos agradecer a Ricky, a Ellen, a Natalie y a José en la primera parte quien nos ayudó, y queremos tomar este momento también para notar y honrar la importancia que es reconocer que realmente somos una nación de inmigrantes y reconocer la importancia que es documentar y celebrar nuestras historias y todas nuestras culturas y de dónde venimos.